Amid the ashes of a fallen empire, silence spoke louder than any cannon. If a nation can lose its leader in one afternoon and wake up to hunger, ash, and fear, what keeps ordinary people alive the next morning? The cities of Germany were no longer cities, but broken bones of a body that had once believed itself immortal. Mothers carried children through the smoke. Fathers returned from the front to find only walls scorched and streets buried under bricks. Peace did not arrive with a signature. It arrived with blistered hands, with dust on the face, with the whisper of survival. On the 30th day of April, year 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life in a bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. Outside, the empire he promised for 1,000 years collapsed in less than a week. The world called it victory. But for those left behind, it was only the beginning of another war, the fight to eat, to endure, and to rebuild among the ruins. So let us return to that moment, not to glorify destruction, but to ask one question. After the fire, how does life begin again? The morning after Hitler's death was not a dawn. It was a shadow stretching endlessly over a land that no longer knew its own name. Berlin, once the heart of power, had turned into a skeleton of blackened walls and collapsed bridges. The air itself seemed heavy with ash and disbelief. There were no speeches, no parades, no sound of relief, only rumors traveling from mouth to mouth like ghosts in the fog. "The Führer is dead," someone whispered, but even that sentence carried no meaning anymore. What did it matter when the world itself was already dead? The empire had promised glory, order, and eternity. What remained was a silence so thick it swallowed the human voice. Offices were abandoned. Trains stood frozen on twisted rails. Church bells hung mute in their towers. Money had become useless paper. People traded bread for watches, coats for a handful of potatoes. And in every ruined neighborhood, the same question echoed. Who is in charge now? The state had vanished overnight. There was no government to issue orders, no police to enforce them, no radio that spoke with authority. In that void, chaos began to breathe. Families dug into basements, lighting candles that flickered like small souls. Above them, the streets were filled with scavengers, children searching through rubble, old men pushing carts, women carrying buckets of dirty water. In a city where death had become routine, life continued out of stubborn habit. Across the countryside, soldiers kept fighting battles that no longer had a purpose. Many did not even know their leader was gone. Some fought because they feared execution if they stopped. Others fought because surrender to the Soviets meant almost certain death. The war did not end with a gunshot in the bunker. It lingered in every trench, in every field, in every frightened heart. The phrase, "fight to the last man," had become, curse. By May, entire divisions had dissolved into dust. The once proud army was now a mass of starving boys and broken veterans stumbling through ruins. Their uniforms were torn, their eyes hollow. When they met Allied patrols, some threw down their weapons, others simply kept walking, as if the idea of surrender no longer made sense. In the absence of command, human instinct took over. The instinct to survive one more night, to find one more crust of bread, to keep a child alive until morning. Inside the cities, order collapsed with frightening speed. Shops stood empty. The water ran only a few hours a day. Electricity was a luxury few remembered. The smell of rotting horses and trapped corpses hung in the air, blending with the smoke of burnt timber. The grand boulevards had become rivers of debris. Avenues that once carried soldiers and parades now carried silence. At the corner of a bombed building, a small crowd gathered around a makeshift market. On the ground, a man traded a gold wedding ring for a loaf of dark, bitter bread. Two women argued over a handful of dried potatoes. Children stood barefoot, holding tin cups, waiting for something, anything, to fall into them. This was the new economy of survival. A cigarette was worth a dinner. A tin of canned meat could buy a pair of boots, and everyone, rich or poor, waited in the same line. Hunger had made them equal. In the ruins of a church, a priest without a congregation knelt alone before a cracked altar. He prayed not for victory, not even for forgiveness, but simply for an end to the noise. Outside, a mother pressed a damp cloth to her child's lips, whispering that tomorrow there would be food. She did not believe it, but the lie gave the child enough strength to sleep. Everywhere, the myth of control dissolved. The Nazi regime had built its power on precision, on schedules, uniforms, and fear. Now all that was left was the raw confusion of humanity stripped bare. The proud words about destiny and purity vanished into dust. What remained was hunger, exhaustion, and a strange, aching quiet. Germany had lost its leader, its faith, and its reflection. In that emptiness, small acts of kindness began to appear like sparks. Neighbors shared what little food they had. Strangers helped one another dig through the rubble for lost relatives. An old man gave his coat to a shivering boy he did not know. No one called it heroism. It was simply what people did when the world around them had stopped making sense. At night, the city was a sea of darkness. Windows were broken, roofs gone, chimneys standing alone like gravestones. The wind carried the sound of distant artillery and the soft cry of someone calling a name that would never be answered. The stars looked down on a land both punished and reborn, and for the first time in years, there were no banners, no slogans, only the sound of breathing, the proof that life, somehow, still persisted. This was the Germany of early May, year 1, 1945. A landscape not only of physical destruction but of moral collapse. People did not speak of politics. They spoke of bread, of water, of coal. They spoke of missing sons and vanished husbands. And in their silence, a quiet truth began to take root. Peace, if it ever came, would not be given by leaders or soldiers. It would be built by the hands of those who had nothing left. So when we ask what it meant to live after the war, to live after the Führer, the answer is not written in history books or victory speeches. It is written in those hands, rough and trembling, that still reached out to lift a brick, to share a crust, to comfort a child in the dark. Because after all the fire and the death, survival itself had become an act of rebellion. The death of Hitler did not bring peace. It unleashed another storm, silent, lawless, and cruel. When the Soviet troops entered Berlin, the streets turned into corridors of fear. The victors marched through the ruins not as liberators, but as men carrying their own ghosts. They had seen their homes burned, their families massacred. Now, revenge became their language. For many German women, the surrender of their country was not the end of war, but the beginning of a new nightmare. In the basements where families hid, footsteps echoed on the stairs like drumbeats of terror. Doors were broken. Cries filled the air, cries that would remain buried in silence for decades. Age offered no protection. Young girls, mothers, grandmothers, all were swept into the same wave of violence. The war had erased every line between right and wrong, soldier and civilian, victory and cruelty. In the face of such darkness, even survival felt like betrayal. And yet, amid that brutality, life still tried to move. When the Red Army passed, when the shouting faded, women emerged from the ruins, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They washed their wounds in buckets of cold water, wrapped themselves in torn blankets, and walked into the streets to find food for their children. Each step was a defiance, a quiet rebellion against the cruelty that had tried to break them. Across the east, millions of civilians fled westward, carrying what little they could in wheelbarrows, carts, or simply in their arms. They walked for days through snow and mud, crossing a country that no longer existed. The roads were lined with the bodies of those who could not go on, the elderly, the infants, the sick. They were not soldiers. They were the forgotten army of refugees, the human tide left behind by a crumbling empire. Their footsteps were the soundtrack of a nation exiled from itself. Entire villages emptied overnight. Keys were kept in pockets as useless relics of homes that would never be opened again. Every step westward was a step away from memory. Orchards, rivers, schoolyards, all erased by new borders drawn by foreign hands. They called it relocation. But for those who walked, it was exile, pure and endless. Hunger became the new enemy, and it was everywhere. The fields had been bombed, the barns burned, the railways destroyed, cities starved. In Berlin, bakeries opened for only a few hours, serving dark loaves made with barley, sawdust, or whatever flour could still be found. People waited for hours, silent, staring at the person in front of them, hoping the bread would not run out before their turn. Even the smell of baking bread felt like salvation. Coffee disappeared. Watered-down soups replaced milk for children. Meat became a myth. A few lucky ones traded jewelry for canned food. Others searched the ruins for pigeons, stray cats, or dogs. Necessity blurred the line between survival and shame. The once proud society of discipline and order had turned into a desperate struggle for calories. And in that struggle, everyone was equal. At night, the black market came alive in the rubble of railway stations. Quick whispers, trembling hands, small packets exchanged under coats, a gold watch for a handful of flour, a pair of boots for a tin of meat, tobacco, alcohol, medicine. They were the new currency of life. A single cigarette could buy warmth, food, or a moment of illusion. The sound of a match striking became the rhythm of survival. Morality, like the buildings, had collapsed. The old rules no longer made sense in a world where law had vanished. Stealing was not a crime. It was a skill. Prostitution was not a scandal. It was a trade of necessity. Mothers justified what they never thought they could, whispering to themselves, "If this keeps us alive, it is not sin." Faith turned into a whisper, too soft to be heard above the stomach's growl. The city became a map of quiet deals and hidden compromises. Neighbors no longer trusted one another. A loaf of bread could end a friendship. A secret could buy survival. The very language of daily life changed. Children learned foreign words first: chocolate, bread, cigarette, words that could open the mercy of an occupying soldier. Still, in this moral collapse, there were flickers of light. An American soldier handing chocolate to a starving boy. A German woman giving her only blanket to an orphan. A priest sharing his soup with those who mocked his prayers. Tiny gestures, invisible in history books, but powerful enough to remind the broken that kindness had not entirely died. Germany was not only defeated, it was disoriented, a body without a soul, a people without a center. The streets no longer belonged to anyone. Every window seemed to stare back with empty eyes. Every sound, a boot, a breath, a whisper, carried the weight of fear. But within that fear lived something stubborn: endurance. Those who survived learned new laws, not written in books, but carved into instinct. Protect the child, find water, keep walking, share if you can, hide when you must, and above all, never look back. Because to look back was to face the unbearable truth that the world they had known, the one built on banners and promises, no longer existed. When people spoke of the future, their voices were low, almost afraid of hope. They did not dream of glory anymore. They dreamed of bread, of warmth, of silence that did not come from death. The country had been taught obedience. Now it was learning humility. And from that humility, something new, fragile but real, began to grow. If you believe that peace is what the world needs all along, say Amen in the comments below. Because peace is not born from treaties. It is born from hunger shared, from hands that refuse to let go, from the simple decision to keep each other alive. When the echo of cannons faded, the war did not truly end. Germany lay divided, bruised, and unrecognizable, a body dissected by its conquerors. Foreign flags fluttered where the swastika once stood. Each color marked a zone of control. Soviet red in the east, British blue in the north, American stars in the south, and later the French tricolor in the west. For ordinary Germans, this was not liberation. It was occupation. Every street, every home, every loaf of bread now belonged to someone else's authority. Soldiers patrolled corners with rifles hanging loosely, their expressions unreadable. Signs appeared in new languages: English, Russian, French. Children repeated these foreign words to earn a smile, or perhaps a sweet from a soldier. The country that had once spoken with one voice now spoke in fragments, syllables of submission. In the Eastern Zone, fear became routine. The Red Army ruled with an iron hand. Factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and sent to the Soviet Union. Men accused of collaborating were arrested without trial. Others simply disappeared into the night. People whispered of deportations, of neighbors taken to camps far away. The only law was survival, and silence was its shield. In the Western zones, the occupation was colder, more bureaucratic. The Americans and British established offices, ration cards, and curfews. Every citizen stood in line for permission slips, to travel, to work, even to repair a roof. Paperwork replaced ideology, stamps replaced slogans. But behind the routine of regulation hid the same truth. Defeat had turned every German into a guest in their own home. And yet, the human spirit refused to remain a guest forever. In the middle of this foreign rule, life began to take root again. Children chased each other through craters that once held bombs. Mothers planted small gardens between ruins, growing cabbage and potatoes in what had been courtyards of fire. An old teacher reopened classes in a basement, writing the alphabet on a wall of cracked plaster. No textbooks, no desks, only determination. The women of the Rubble became the new army. Wrapped in scarves, hands raw from frost and broken brick, they cleared the streets one wheelbarrow at a time. They lifted stones heavier than their bodies, stacking them neatly in piles that grew into man-made hills. Scars turned into symbols. Children passed bricks hand to hand like prayers. No speeches were given, no medals awarded. But every shovel of debris was an act of resurrection. The sound of hammers slowly replaced the sound of artillery. Tink, pause, breath, another tink, a rhythm of rebirth. In those streets of dust, men and women rebuilt walls, repaired trams, reopened markets. A roof made of tin was better than no roof at all. A single working lamp was a victory. Hospitals reopened in half-destroyed buildings. Doctors treated the wounded with bandages made of torn sheets. Churches, when still standing, filled again, not with political speeches, but with whispers of gratitude for surviving another day. Hunger still stalked every corner. Rations were meager. Coal was scarce. Winter entered through every crack. But now hunger shared was different from hunger alone. People began to trade again, not only goods, but hope. Tomorrow, someone would say, the bakery might open again. Tomorrow, another whispered. The tram might run. It was not certainty, but it was enough to keep them alive. The occupation also brought strange cultural exchanges. In the American zones, jazz crackled through old radios salvaged from the rubble. Young Germans listened in secret, tapping their feet to rhythms they did not understand but could feel. Swing records, chewing gum, and black and white Hollywood films offered a glimpse of another world, one with light, laughter, and color. In the East, parades and red flags replaced the old ones, and new songs of ideology filled the air. The two Germanys began to grow apart before they even had names. Still, in both East and West, people longed for the same simple things: bread, shelter, dignity, and peace. They had seen the worst of humankind, and now they searched for its remnants among the ruins. Moral rebuilding was slower than physical reconstruction. Many questioned faith, purpose, and guilt. But for others, faith was the only thing left. In churches with shattered windows, pastors preached about forgiveness not as doctrine, but as survival. If hatred had led to war, perhaps mercy could lead to life. Each day, more signs of rebirth appeared. A tram line reopened. A bakery served fresh loaves for the first time in months. Children played soccer on a field cleared of debris. The laughter of one child echoed louder than any speech. In the market, someone sold flowers again, wilted, fragile, but beautiful in their defiance. It was as if the city itself had decided to breathe again. In those early years after World War II, Reconstruction was not about politics. It was about people rediscovering their humanity. They no longer asked what Germany would become. They asked what it meant to be human after so much inhumanity. Each wall raised was a confession. Each planted seed, an apology. Each helping hand, a vow not to repeat the past. From the ashes of empire rose the quietest. Revolution of all, the return of compassion. There were no marching bands, no flags, no slogans. Only the sound of hearts refusing to stop. Only the hands that built, the voices that forgave, the souls that somehow chose to love again. When the guns fell silent, the war was supposed to be over. But the end of battle did not mean the beginning of peace. For Germany, and for the world, peace had to be learned all over again, brick by brick, hand by hand, heart by heart. The people who survived did not rebuild for glory. They rebuilt because they refused to vanish. Every wall raised among the ruins was a declaration that life had not surrendered. Every loaf of bread baked from scavenged flour was an act of courage, and every child who laughed among the ashes was proof that history, though cruel, could still be forgiven. World War II left the world scarred, but it also revealed the endurance of the human spirit. It showed that even after the collapse of nations and the betrayal of ideals, people could still choose kindness. They could still build homes out of rubble and trust out of silence. That choice, quiet, stubborn, and unseen, became the true victory of humankind. In the years that followed, the echoes of World War II continued to shape our conscience. The ruins turned into schools, the broken factories into workshops, the bombed churches into places of prayer once again. But the greatest reconstruction was not made of stone or steel. It was the rebuilding of empathy, the rediscovery of what it meant to care for one another. And as the decades passed, another truth became clear. The memory of suffering is not meant to divide us, but to remind us. Remind us that peace is not inherited. It is earned, protected, and passed on like a fragile flame. Each generation must decide whether that flame will fade or burn brighter. The story of World War II is not just about armies and empires. It is about ordinary people who, in the face of despair, chose to live, to forgive, and to start again. It is about the women who cleared the rubble, the children who planted flowers where bombs had fallen, the men who chose to share their last piece of bread. They were not heroes in uniform. They were heroes of endurance. So when you walk through a peaceful street today, remember, it was built upon hands that once trembled. When you hear laughter, remember the silence it replaced. And when you see the world drifting toward division, remember what it cost to rebuild it once before. If this story moved you, do not stay silent. Leave a comment below. Say, fight for peace, fight for justice, fight for freedom. Because history is not only what we inherit, it is what we choose to defend.